Everything you think you know about the worst punishments in history is wrong. Forget the guillotine. Forget crucifixion. Forget being drawn and quartered. The absolute worst fate that could befall a human being in the ancient world wasn't a quick death by sword or a dramatic execution in the public square. It was something far more sinister, far more calculated, and far more horrifying than your darkest nightmares could conjure. It was called scaphism, and it was designed to keep you alive for as long as possible while your own body became your tomb. Picture this. You're trapped between two boats, unable to move, force-fed milk and honey until it pours from every opening in your body. Then you wait. You wait as swarms of insects descend upon you, drawn by the sweetness coating your flesh. You wait as they burrow into your eyes, your mouth, your most intimate places. You wait as your own waste accumulates around you, as gangrene sets in, as your body literally rots away while you're still breathing. And the most terrifying part? This could go on for weeks. Welcome to the story of humanity's cruelest invention, a punishment so barbaric that even ancient historians struggled to describe it without recoiling in horror. This is the true story of scaphism, the boats of death, and how a single moment of battlefield confusion led one young soldier to endure 17 days of unimaginable torment. The year is 401 BC. The Persian Empire stretches from the Mediterranean Sea to the borders of India, the largest empire the world has ever known. When King Darius II died, he left behind two sons with vastly different destinies. Artaxerxes, the elder, inherited the throne by right of succession, but Cyrus, the younger, possessed something perhaps more dangerous: ambition that burned like wildfire and the charisma to convince others to die for his cause. Cyrus had spent years building his rebellion, gathering Greek mercenaries, Persian nobles, and anyone desperate or brave enough to challenge the established order. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Cunaxa, somewhere in the dusty plains of Mesopotamia. Thousands of men clashed under the scorching sun, their bronze weapons glinting like deadly stars. And in the chaos of that battlefield, a young Persian soldier named Mithridates was about to make a mistake that would haunt him far beyond death. Here's what makes this story even more chilling. Mithridates wasn't some bloodthirsty mercenary or power-hungry noble. He was just a regular soldier, probably in his early 20s, fighting for what he thought was right. In any other war, in any other time, his actions might have earned him a medal. Instead, they earned him a fate worse than any hell imaginable. The battle raged for hours. Dust clouds obscured friend from foe. In the confusion, as Cyrus led his cavalry in what would be his final charge, something went wrong. Accounts vary, but what seems certain is that Mithridates, whether through accident, misunderstanding, or split-second battlefield decision, struck down the rebel prince. Cyrus the Younger, brother to the king, claimant to the throne, leader of the rebellion, fell dead in the dirt. The battle was over. Artaxerxes had won. The empire was secure. But for Mithridates, the real nightmare was just beginning. You have to understand something about ancient Persian culture. In Persia, the royal family was considered divine. They weren't just political figures. They were living embodiments of cosmic order. To harm a member of the royal family, even a rebellious one, was to commit an act of cosmic treason. And Artaxerxes, too, despite having every reason to celebrate his brother's death, was absolutely furious when he learned that a common soldier had dared to strike down royal blood. But the king faced a dilemma. Mithridates had, technically, done him the greatest possible service. The young soldier had ended the rebellion with a single blow. He had saved the empire and secured Artaxerxes' throne. How do you reward someone for performing a service that was also an unforgivable crime? The answer reveals something terrifying about power and the lengths to which rulers will go to maintain the mystique of their authority. Artaxerxes couldn't simply execute Mithridates. That would suggest the soldier had done something wrong. But he also couldn't reward him. That would set a precedent that common soldiers could kill royalty without consequences. So the king chose a third option. An option so cruel, so deliberately horrific, that it would serve as a warning to anyone who might dare overstep their station in the future. He sentenced Mithridates to scaphism. Scaphism comes from the Greek word scaphe, meaning boat. But these weren't the boats you'd want to sail in. These were boats of death, designed with one purpose: to keep a human being alive while their body slowly transformed into a rotting feast for every insect and scavenger in the kingdom. The process was as methodical as it was monstrous. 2 small boats or hollowed-out tree trunks were brought forward. Think of them like coffins, but worse, because coffins are meant to house the dead, while these contraptions were designed to torture the living. If this revelation about humanity's capacity for cruelty shocked you, smash that like button, because we're just getting started. And if you're brave enough to continue this journey into history's darkest corners, hit that subscribe button and join our community of history seekers who aren't afraid to confront the uncomfortable truths about our past. The victim, in this case, young Mithridates, was placed in the lower boat, lying on his back. His head, hands, and feet were left protruding through carefully carved holes. Then the second boat was placed on top, creating a human sandwich with only his extremities exposed to the world. But the true horror of scaphism wasn't in the confinement. It was in what came next. The executioners began force-feeding the victim milk and honey. Not a gentle offering, but a brutal force-feeding that continued until the sweet mixture poured from every opening in the body: the mouth, the nose, and eventually other orifices as the digestive system rebelled against the constant influx. Then they smeared more milk and honey on the exposed face, hands, and feet. Every visible inch of flesh became a sticky, sweet beacon calling to every fly, wasp, bee, and crawling insect in the region. The victim was then left in the sun, usually near a swamp or stagnant water where insect populations thrived. And then the real torture began. Imagine lying perfectly still, unable to swat away the flies that begin to gather on your honeyed skin. First a few, then dozens, then hundreds. They crawl into your eyes, up your nostrils, into your mouth. You can't brush them away. You can't move. You can only lie there as they begin to feast. But insects weren't the only concern. The constant feeding of milk and honey, combined with the inability to control bodily functions, meant that the victim was soon lying in their own waste. In the sweltering heat of the Persian sun, this created a breeding ground for bacteria and disease. Gangrene would set in within days. The flesh would begin to rot while the victim was still alive, still conscious, still feeling every moment of their slow dissolution. And the most diabolical aspect of all, the executioners would return each day to force-feed the victim again, ensuring they had just enough nutrition to stay alive for their prolonged ordeal. Ancient historians tell us that Mithridates endured this horror for 17 days. 17 days of feeling his own body decay around him. 17 days of insects burrowing into his rotting flesh. 17 days of being kept alive to experience every moment of his own decomposition. Try to imagine what 17 days would feel like in such conditions. The first day might bring shock and disbelief. By the third day, the initial wounds from insect bites will be festering. By the first week, gangrene would be setting in. By the second week, the victim would be more corpse than living person, yet somehow still breathing, still aware. The psychological torture was perhaps even worse than the physical agony. The victim knew exactly what was happening to their body. They could feel the rot advancing, could smell their own decay, could see the insects that were slowly consuming them alive. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. Scaphism wasn't some anomaly, some one-time punishment dreamed up in a moment of royal rage. Historical records suggest it was an established form of execution in the Persian Empire, reserved for the most heinous crimes against the state. This raises uncomfortable questions about power and justice that echo through the centuries. How thin is the line between order and tyranny? When does punishment become mere cruelty dressed up in the robes of law? The ancient Persian Empire prided itself on being a civilization, a beacon of culture, art, and learning in a world of barbarians. They built magnificent palaces, created beautiful poetry, developed sophisticated systems of law and administration. Yet they also created scaphism. How do we reconcile these contradictions? Perhaps the answer lies in understanding that civilization is not the absence of barbarism, but rather barbarism refined and systematized. The savagery of scaphism wasn't the product of primitive minds, but of highly intelligent people who devoted considerable thought to creating the most effective form of torture possible. What do you think drove the Persians to develop such an elaborate torture method? Was it mere cruelty, or was there some twisted logic behind it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The story of Mithridates and his 17 days of agony didn't end with his death. You see, scaphism wasn't really about punishing individual criminals. It was about sending a message to an entire empire. Every person who heard the story of Mithridates' fate understood exactly what would happen to anyone who dared to challenge royal authority, no matter how justified their actions might seem. The cruelty was the point. The excess was intentional. The horror was designed to lodge itself in the imagination of every subject in the empire, creating a psychological barrier more effective than any physical wall. But there's another layer to this story that makes it even more complex. The primary source for our knowledge of Mithridates' fate comes from Plutarch, a Greek historian writing centuries after the events. Modern scholars note that his source, Ctesias, had a reputation for fanciful and exaggerated narratives. This raises the disturbing possibility that scaphism might have been even worse than we imagine, or conversely, that it might have been a propaganda story designed to make the Persian Empire seem more terrifying than it actually was. But even if we allow for historical exaggeration, the fact remains that scaphism was considered plausible enough to be recorded and believed by ancient historians. The very fact that people thought such a punishment was possible tells us something chilling about the world they lived in. And here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Scaphism wasn't unique to Persia. Throughout human history, societies around the world have independently developed remarkably similar methods of prolonged execution. The Chinese had lingqi, the death of 1,000 cuts. Medieval Europe had various forms of breaking on the wheel. The Aztecs had their own elaborate rituals of sacrifice designed to maximize suffering. It seems that whenever humans gain power over other humans, some dark part of our nature compels us to explore the outer limits of cruelty. This pattern repeats throughout history with disturbing regularity. Different cultures, different time periods, different justifications, but always the same underlying impulse to transform execution from a necessary evil into an art form of agony. What does this say about us as a species? Perhaps the most honest answer is that humans are capable of both extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary kindness, and the context in which we live largely determines which aspect of our nature dominates. But that raises another troubling question. What context create the conditions for something like scaphism to not just exist, but to be accepted as legitimate justice? The Persian Empire of Artaxerxes, too, wasn't a chaotic wasteland ruled by madmen. It was a sophisticated civilization with laws, courts, and established procedures. Scaphism wasn't the product of mob justice or wartime brutality. It was an official punishment carried out by the state, justified by legal and religious authority. In other words, scaphism was the product of normal people operating within normal institutions, following normal procedures. It was bureaucratized cruelty, systematic suffering, organized agony. The infrastructure that made scaphism possible, the acceptance of absolute authority, the dehumanization of enemies, the bureaucratization of cruelty, didn't disappear with the ancient world. These same patterns appear throughout history, in different forms and under different names, but with the same underlying logic. This is why understanding historical atrocities like scaphism is so important. Not because we're morbidly fascinated by suffering, but because we need to recognize the warning signs when similar patterns begin to emerge in our own societies. If this historical deep dive is making you think differently about human nature and the societies we build, hit that like button to let me know you're engaging with these difficult questions. And if you want to be part of a community that doesn't shy away from history's uncomfortable truths, make sure you're subscribed, because we've got much more to explore together. The decline of scaphism as a punishment tells us something hopeful about human progress, even if that progress has been frustratingly slow and uneven. As the Persian Empire evolved and eventually fell to Alexander the Great, practices like scaphism began to disappear. The real changes came much later, with the gradual development of concepts we now take for granted. The idea that punishment should fit the crime, that even criminals retain some basic human dignity, that the state's power to inflict suffering should have limits. The abolition of torture as an accepted judicial practice was one of the great moral achievements of the Enlightenment, though even then it took centuries to implement and is still not universal today. But even as we celebrate this progress, we have to acknowledge how fragile it is. The same human impulses that created scaphism still exist. The same justifications that made it seem reasonable to ancient authorities, the need for order, the importance of deterrence, the dehumanization of enemies, still appear in modern debates about criminal justice. Every generation has to actively choose to reject these impulses. The progress isn't automatic, and it can be reversed. In some ways, this makes the story of Mithridates strangely relevant to our modern world. We still face the fundamental questions that his fate represents. How much suffering is justified in the name of justice? When does punishment become revenge? How do we maintain order without becoming monsters ourselves? These aren't academic questions. They play out in contemporary debates about criminal justice, military interrogation, and the limits of state power. The specific methods change, but the underlying moral challenges remain the same. Mithridates, remember, wasn't sentenced to scaphism because he was a monster. He was sentenced because he was a young soldier who found himself in an impossible situation and made a split-second decision that happened to violate cosmic order as defined by absolute rulers. In a different context with different rules, he might have been a hero. Instead, he became a cautionary tale about the price of overstepping boundaries that existed more in the minds of rulers than in any objective moral framework. This arbitrary nature of his fate is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the whole story. It suggests that the line between victim and perpetrator, between justice and cruelty, between civilization and barbarism, is far thinner than we like to believe. On one level, scaphism represents humanity at its absolute worst, the deliberate infliction of maximum suffering for psychological and political effect. But on another level, the fact that scaphism horrifies us, the fact that we recoil from it even across the vast gulf of 24 centuries, suggests something hopeful about human moral development. The ancient historians who recorded these events weren't celebrating them. They were documenting them with obvious revulsion. Even in societies that practiced extreme cruelty, there were voices of conscience that recognized something was deeply wrong. This gives us reason to hope that our capacity for moral progress, while slow and imperfect, is real. The abolition of judicial torture, the development of international human rights law, the growing recognition that all humans possess inherent dignity regardless of their actions. These represent genuine advances over the worldview that created scaphism. But they also represent fragile advances that require constant vigilance to maintain. The same psychological and social factors that made scaphism possible still exist today. The desire for revenge against those who harm us, the tendency to dehumanize our enemies, the willingness to accept extreme measures when we're afraid, the temptation to believe that our cause is so righteous that any means are justified. These impulses are as human as compassion and mercy. The question isn't whether we have them. The question is whether we recognize them and consciously choose to constrain them. And that's where the story of Mithridates becomes more than just a historical curiosity. It becomes a mirror in which we can see our own capacity for both cruelty and conscience. Every time we're tempted to believe that our enemies deserve whatever suffering we can inflict upon them, we should remember the young Persian soldier who died over 17 days for the crime of doing his duty in a moment of battlefield confusion. Every time we're asked to accept extreme measures in the name of security or justice, We should ask whether we're following the path of moral progress or sliding back toward the mindset that created scaphism. The boats of death are gone, but the psychology that created them lives on in every human heart. The question is whether we'll recognize it and choose something better. What do you think? Are humans fundamentally cruel beings held in check only by law and social pressure? Or are we fundamentally good beings who occasionally succumb to our darkest impulses? The answer matters more than you might think, because it shapes how we build our societies and treat each other. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this exploration of history's darkest corners has made you think differently about human nature and moral progress, make sure you're subscribed, because we'll be diving deeper into these questions in future videos. As we reach the end of this journey into the depths of human cruelty, one question remains. What would you have done if you were Artaxerxes II? Your brother is dead, killed by a common soldier in service to your crown. Your empire is secure, but your divine authority has been challenged by the very act that saved your throne. Traditional justice demands punishment, but gratitude suggests reward. Political necessity requires a response that will discourage future challenges to royal authority. Do you reward Mithridates and risk appearing weak? Do you execute him quickly and risk seeming ungrateful? Or do you choose the path that Artaxerxes chose, a punishment so extreme that it serves as both vengeance and warning? It's easy to condemn the choice from our modern perspective, but place yourself in the sandals of an ancient king, surrounded by advisors whispering about divine authority and cosmic order, in a world where mercy could be seen as weakness, and weakness could mean the collapse of everything you've worked to build. The horrifying possibility is that many of us might have made the same choice. And that might be the most disturbing lesson of all from this 2,400-year-old story of a young soldier and the boats of death that became his tomb. The capacity for both extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary compassion lies within every human being. The context we create, the institutions we build, and the choices we make determine which aspect of our nature prevails. Scaphism is a reminder of what we're capable of at our worst. But the fact that we're horrified by it, that we recognize it as wrong even across the centuries, is evidence of what we're capable of at our best. The question isn't whether we'll ever completely eliminate cruelty from human society. History suggests we won't. The question is whether we'll keep working to minimize it, to constrain our worst impulses, and to build institutions that bring out the better angels of our nature. That work is never finished. Each generation has to choose anew whether to move toward justice or revenge, toward mercy or retribution, toward recognizing our common humanity or surrendering to our tribal hatreds. The story of Mithridates and his 17 days of agony in the boats of death stands as a permanent warning about the price of choosing wrongly. But it also stands as a testament to the possibility of choosing better. What choice will you make? What choice will we make? The boats are gone, but the questions they raise about power, justice, and human nature remain as relevant today as they were in ancient Persia. And in the end, that might be the most important lesson of all, that understanding history's darkest chapters isn't about satisfying morbid curiosity, but about ensuring that we have the wisdom and courage to write better chapters in the future. The choice, as always, is ours.